we will be exploring one of the most notorious covert military projects of all time, involving an alleged attempt during World War II to make a naval vessel disappear from the visual plane. In the aftermath, it was soon discovered that the test had tragic consequences, leaving many of its crew in states of unimaginable insanity, catatonia, and in some cases, far worse. Join us as we examine the infamous Philadelphia experiment. On the evening of October the 28th, 1943, Carl Allen and his crewmates had been waiting up on the deck of their ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth. Lying nearly 100 meters away from their position was a brand new Cannon-class destroyer escort, the USS Eldridge. Only 5 minutes before, the deck and upper workings of that vessel had been a hubbub of activity, until the order had been given for her crew to go below. Now, as she sat there on the surface of the water, surrounded by a plethora of other ships, she seemed almost abandoned. Allen and his crewmates speculated amongst themselves on what they were about to witness, but no one could be sure. They had only heard whispers. In any case, the mumbled conversations soon subsided as an ominous low humming began to emanate from the Eldridge. As they watched on, it appeared that she was beginning to smoke, but upon closer inspection, they realized that a greenish haze with no apparent source was now enveloping her entire hull. It quickly expanded far beyond her superstructure, to a point where it hung in the air only a meter or so from the deck of the Andrew Furuseth. All of a sudden, there was a blinding flash of light. Moments later, Allen and his crewmates were amazed to see that whilst the green haze had remained, the destroyer escort itself had completely vanished. As a low murmur of amazement began to circulate amongst them, Allen leaned over the deck railings and reached out, in an attempt to penetrate the strange greenish fog before him. But rather than going through the vapour, his hand was repelled. After several more minutes, they were surprised by another brilliant flash, which quickly subsided. To their utter astonishment, the Eldridge had now returned to her original position. Amidst an immediate barrage of orders to vacate the Andrew Furuseth and head ashore, Allen caught sight of several technicians, scientists and Navy personnel getting into waiting launches and making their way towards the destroyer escort. To his eyes, there was now an ominous air about the vessel, a brooding silence in which she seemed almost a spectre of her former self. And as it would transpire, these misgivings would prove to be well placed. 43 years later, Carl Allen, now going by the name of Carlos Allende, remained haunted by the events he had witnessed at the Philadelphia Naval Yards on that cold October evening. Near penniless and living a reclusive existence in a quiet rural farming town, he had sadly become estranged from most of his family. And yet, few of those who had met him during those intervening years could have suspected he had been involved in such horrors. The 61-year-old exuded a warm and trustworthy demeanour towards those he encountered, but his health was now failing, with a series of increasingly regular hospital admissions having caused him to accept the likelihood of his impending demise. This realization had prompted him to reach out to an investigative reporter named Jim Frazier, who had agreed to meet with the former sailor at his home in Greeley, Colorado. During the course of that interview on the 14th of August 1986, Allende would stun the reporter with a complex series of scientific revelations. He would explain how hidden elements within the US military had managed to seemingly rewrite the accepted laws of physics, causing a solid steel warship to disappear completely from sight, and how in the process of doing so, they had inadvertently teleported the vessel several hundred miles away to a different location. In that same conversation, he would relate how the experiment would have been deemed a complete success and much more, if not for the tragic set of consequences that followed. Because where the unfortunate crew members of the USS Eldridge were concerned, it had been a complete and utter failure. With every step that the technicians and escorting military personnel had taken deeper into the bowels of the USS Eldridge, it had seemed like they were being carried ever closer to hell itself. The experiment had clearly knocked out all power on the vessel, meaning they could only conduct their investigation by the light of their torches. Upon encountering the first few members of the ship's crew, it quickly became clear that the experiment had taken an awful toll on them. Several were unconscious, unable to be roused despite whatever method was applied. Others appeared frozen in place, unmoving, assuming the position they had been in at the time of the experiment. Those who were responsive were either crying out in pain or mumbling incoherently, trying to form sentences that made no sense because their words were bizarrely out of sequence. As they continued their descent further into the ship's lower decks, it became horrendously clear that not all of the crew had survived. One sailor was found staring in shock at his right arm, which had somehow become fused with the bulkhead he had presumably stumbled against during the experiment. As the technicians drew closer to him, they were horrified to see that the cold hard steel was now completely integrated with the flesh and bone of the affected limb. Another crew member was found with the lower half of his body now missing, having sunken into and become fused with the metal flooring. The shock of what had taken place was clearly etched upon the poor soul's agonized features, frozen in time at the point he had lost his life. The deeper into the warship's interior the group went, the worse the effects of the experiment seemed to have been upon the crew. 3 more sailors were found to have been swallowed up or integrated into the ship's hull at various points, none of whom could be revived or saved. Even more horrific was the bloodied remains of several men who appeared to have been turned inside out, with sections of their uniform and dog tags just visible from within the grisly mass of flesh and bone they had been reduced to. As time passed, the rooms and corridors of the Eldridge began to fill with anguished cries and howls as the minds of those trapped inside began to swim back into focus. In the aftermath, the surviving crew members were closely monitored. They had been sworn to secrecy regarding the details of the experiment, but as it would transpire, many of these sailors had sustained long-lasting and even permanent anomalous side effects as a result of what they had been subjected to. Some would descend into sudden episodes of madness, acting with uncontrollable rage and anger for a brief period, before suddenly returning to normal as if nothing had happened. Certain crew members, however, would suffer a complete mental breakdown and never recover. In other cases, the unfortunate individuals would become trapped in what Alan referred to as deep freezes. In essence, those affected would immobilize on the spot, frozen in the pose of whatever action they had been conducting at the time, much like a statue. Incredibly, in a small number of these instances, the crewman would fade out of existence and never rematerialize. One sailor who became disorientated was observed to walk straight through a solid brick wall and was never seen again. During another incident, 2 sailors from the Eldridge became embroiled in a bar fight with crew members of another ship, only to then suddenly vanish in the midst of the ruckus. There were also rumours of an even more disturbing event in which a former Eldridge crew member experiencing a deep freeze inexplicably burst into flames. His inert remains continued to burn uncontrollably for a further 18 days, despite efforts to extinguish the blaze. When pressed on an explanation for these terrifying incidents by Jim Frazier, Allen stated that he did not believe the torment experienced by the men was psychological. It was instead a physical side effect of the electromagnetic field they had been exposed to, which had knocked them temporarily out of sync with the rest of the world. In most cases, the simple laying on of hands by a friend or family member would somehow anchor the suffering person to reality and prevent them from fading away. But for a few unfortunate souls, this simple alleviation would not always prove successful. Whilst Allen could not fully explain the principles behind what would become known as the Philadelphia experiment, he did provide insight as to what had been intended, explaining that the scientists involved were experimenting with an idea known as unified field theory. This concept centered on the idea that fundamental forces such as electromagnetism and gravity could be amplified via the generation of significant amounts of electricity. In the process of doing so, it was further theorized that various underlying principles and side effects of these forces would simultaneously be increased. As a result, escalations in the degree of light reflection and refraction could and should therefore render objects inside the affected zone invisible to various forms of detection. Given the observations of Allen and the others present at the time of the alleged experiment, this would seem to have been successfully achieved. After all, the USS Eldridge did disappear completely from the visual plane, before then reappearing several minutes later. But during interviews with the ship's crew in the days and weeks that followed, it became clear that there may have been a further unanticipated result of the experiment. After regaining their memories following the stresses they had been subjected to, several claimed that the ship had been teleported elsewhere in the process. During this temporary displacement, they believed they had recognized some of the features of the naval base at Norfolk in Virginia, located nearly 300 miles away to the south. Discreet inquiries were therefore carried out at the location, and several witnesses reported having briefly seen the USS Eldridge there on the day in question. This alluded to the astounding possibility that the electromagnetic forces which had been generated to cloak the vessel had been even more powerful than anticipated. The destroyer escort had somehow been instantaneously teleported over a long distance for a brief period, supposedly breaking every known and accepted law of physics in the process. When searching for evidence outside the testimony of Carl Allen, any investigation into the alleged experiment immediately runs into a high degree of difficulty. Official naval records show that the USS Eldridge was only commissioned in August of 1943 and spent the first 6 months of her service operating out of New York City. Interviews with surviving veterans at various reunions for the Eldridge's crew have never uncovered anyone who claims to have been involved in the incident. The ship's logs show that the destroyer escort never even docked at the Philadelphia Naval Yards during 1943 and was on a shakedown cruise of the Bahamas throughout October of that year. Similarly, the accompanying logs of the SS Andrew Furuseth show that the transport ship was also nowhere near Philadelphia at the time of the experiment. She was instead in the process of traveling between New York and Oran on the day in question, as part of the wartime convoy UGS-22. Investigations into Allen himself did verify that he was indeed a member of the Andrew Furuseth's crew at that time. He would also go on to serve on several other naval vessels during the course of his military career, before retiring at the end of the war. However, interviews with his family and friends paint the picture of a fantasist who had spent his entire life exaggerating his dealings and encounters with others. Over the course of several interviews he gave on the subject, it was demonstrated that he had clearly altered or embellished various aspects of the tale. At one point, when challenged by a journalist, Allen apparently admitted that he had made the whole story up as a hoax, before he went on to deny this during a subsequent interview. The increasing pushback and criticism of his assertions eventually forced him to retire away from public life, living a relatively elusive and secretive existence where he refused to give any further interviews on the matter until his death in March of 1994. And yet, despite the apparent unreliability contained within Allen's testimony, it has become clear that official experiments using similar principles did in fact take place. Efforts to render ships invisible to magnetic triggers of enemy mines and torpedoes, known as degaussing, were undertaken by the Allied navies during World War II. These involved running a series of electrical cables and coils around the perimeter of the ship in order to generate a decoy low-level electromagnetic field, an example of which can be seen aboard HMS Belfast, a World War II museum ship which is docked on the River Thames in central London. Official papers also seem to suggest that similar experiments were carried out by the United States Navy aboard the USS Hammann. The Hammann was an Edsall-class destroyer, which was indeed based in Philadelphia at the time the events related by Allen are alleged to have taken place. Similarly, there are reports that sailors aboard the USS Timmerman were adversely affected by an electricity field in further post-war degaussing experiments during the 1950s. Over the years, more witnesses who claim to have been present at the Philadelphia naval yards during the experiment have also come forward. These include a former sailor named Alfred Bylick, who claimed to have served aboard the Eldridge at the time and had jumped off the ship at the point the experiment was initiated. His testimony was so haunting in nature that the incident has now been cemented in law as one of the most disturbing military experiments of all time. This has in turn led to suggestions that the US military acted quickly to cover up the tragic events they had perpetrated, replacing the crew of the Eldridge before she saw real service and altering the logs of any and all ships that had been present. They may even have gone as far as assisting in the production of a Hollywood movie based on the subject in order to push it ever further into the realms of science fiction. There are great similarities between the alleged events of the Philadelphia experiment and those of the rumoured German superweapon known as Die Glocke. This only adds more intrigue to the possibility that the militaries of World War II were experimenting with forces which they could not fully comprehend and, to an extent, could not control. These are themes which are also present in another alleged secretive project undertaken by the United States military during the aftermath of that conflict, carried out at an unassuming airbase situated on the eastern tip of Long Island in New York. A sinister and secretive program known as the Montauk Project. Stay tuned for that story.